Alright, I know what you're thinking. Gosh, Brand, you look so handsome today. And you're absolutely right. But that's because I gotta dress to impress if we're gonna honor the best of the best and the worst of the worst that fantasy football has had to offer us so far. These are your 2023 Midseason Fantasy Football Awards. I personally can't believe that we're already at the midway point of the season. In fact, it's giving me a lot of anxiety. But we are, and that means it's time to hand out some awards like MVP, Rookie of the Year, Biggest Value, Biggest Bust, and really get into the nitty-gritty of the players who have defined our fantasy football seasons for better or for worse so far. But without further ado, let's get into the video and hand out some awards. And we're starting with a big one. Your MVP of the first half of the fantasy football season is Christian McCaffrey. Look, this was a close contest, as it's going to be with a lot of these awards. I mean, I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to go with Tyreek Hill or A.J. Brown, two guys both on pace to break Calvin Johnson's single-season receiving yards record. But I'm going with Christian McCaffrey, who just set a record of his own, 17 straight games with a touchdown. I mean, if you're talking about a guy you want to build your fantasy team around, I really can't think of anyone better. He's the RB1 in all of fantasy football, and in PPR leagues, he has 37 more points than the next closest running back, Travis Etienne, who we'll talk about later. This guy has been a fantasy football monster ever since he entered the league, and it's honestly only gotten scarier since he got to San Francisco. They've basically built their entire offense around him, and I personally think he deserves consideration for the actual NFL MVP award, but we all know that's going to go to a quarterback. So hopefully he could take some solace in me giving him this fantasy football midseason award. I'm sure it means just as much. Again, if you wanted to give this award to Tyreek Hill or A.J. Brown, I really wouldn't be mad at you. I'm just giving it to Christian McCaffrey, given not only how bad the running back position has been, but how bad the first rounders have been this year. You take a look at the guys taken in the first round of fantasy football this year, and it's just injuries and disappointment everywhere. Justin Jefferson's on IR. Jamar Chase got off to a slow start. Austin Eckler's missed a bunch of games. Saquon Barkley's been banged up. And then you've got Christian McCaffrey, who's just been as solid as they come, which I guess will happen when you get into the end zone every game. Moving on to the opposite award, we've got Bust of the Year, and this has to go to Najee Harris. We're talking about a guy who in PPR leagues is currently RB 32, despite having an average draft position of 23rd overall. A lot of people were hoping that Najee's ineffectiveness in fantasy last year was because of, lingering injury issues and a bad offensive line and just weird quarterback play. And they were hoping that a lot of those things would get fixed this year. And while I don't think his situation this year is worse, even though Matt Canada is a menace, I just don't think Najee Harris is that good. I mean, he's getting outperformed by Jaylen Warren, who has 9.7 fantasy points per game compared to Najee's 8.5, and has just looked like the better player every time he stepped on the field. Najee's become a player in fantasy football that is borderline unstartable, but also you don't really want to drop him, and that's honestly the worst type of player you could own. Just clogging your bench like a massive fantasy turd all season long. As far as the other contenders for this award, we've got Ramondre Stevenson, who has taken a huge step back since Matt Patricia's departure, which is a frightening sentence to say. In fact, we're talking about a lot of weeks where Ezekiel Elliott actually looks like the more efficient runner, which again, frightening sentence to say. And then we've got one more player for this category, but it's actually not one player. It's every receiver taken in the third round of fantasy football drafts. Look, the third round is usually where you find those high upside receivers who could potentially make that leap to the next level, and usually one or two of them does. This year, not so much. The receivers taken in the third round of fantasy drafts this year included the likes of Chris Olave, Devonta Smith, DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, and Calvin Ridley, none of whom have been good. In fact, the highest scoring one of them so far has been Devonta Smith, who's only wide receiver 22 in PPR leagues. If you took a wide receiver in the third round of your fantasy draft this year, chances are you're having a bad time. All right, let's move on to the guy I teased a little bit ago. The most improved player of the 2023 fantasy football season so far is Travis Etienne. Now, I just talked about how bad the third round of fantasy drafts was for wide receivers, but depending on your league, you could have maybe gotten Travis Etienne in your third round. And if you did, you're very happy. I consider Etienne most improved because he's one of the few players that has made that leap from just pretty good to truly elite for fantasy purposes. Like I said, RB2 in PPR leagues behind only Christian McCaffrey, averaging 20.49 points per game. I mean, just massive production from a guy that I don't think too many people saw making this kind of leap this year. And part of that leap is because he's been finding the end zone. A lot. 8 touchdowns this year already compared to 5 all of last season. Some other players I considered here include DeAndre Swift, DJ Moore, and Nico Collins. As far as Moore and Swift are concerned, I was a little bit less inclined to pick them because they switched teams in order to break out, which isn't anything against them. Obviously, they needed to change their situations to maximize their skill sets. But I'm a little more impressed by a guy who's in the same situation and just turns things up a notch like Travis Etienne has. Nico Collins, on the other hand, has had a similar come up to Travis Etienne by virtue of not leaving his team, but that was because they got CJ Stroud and, he can actually throw the ball. Again, not discrediting any of these guys, I'm just most impressed by Travis Etienne, especially the heights that he's reached so far. Our next award, Best Draft Value of the season, and this goes to Raheem Mostert. Look, I'll be honest, this isn't a guy that I'm expecting to carry you through the end of the fantasy football season, just considering his age and the impending return of Devon Achane, but these are mid-season fantasy football awards, so I'm only evaluating the first 8 weeks of the season, where Raheem Mostert has been RB3. Now, this is a guy that I personally drafted, and I feel pretty good about that. But seriously, anybody out there that drafted Raheem Mostert could not have seen this coming. 19.5 PPR points per game, including that massive 4 touchdown game against the Denver Broncos. For a guy with an average draft position of 114th overall, for you to be able to get one of the top 3 running backs in fantasy football up to this point, you can't ask for any more than that. Honestly, there was really only one other close contender for this, and I'm going to give that guy a different award coming up. It's Adam Thielen, spoiler alert. But outside of Thielen, there really isn't anyone else to even consider for this one. Like, yeah, I could mention Nico Collins, who had an average draft position of 156th and has been a wide receiver 2 so far. Or I could mention Sam Laporta, who had an average draft position of 159th and has been tight end 3 overall this year. But none of that stacks up to being RB3. Just doesn't. And I'm sure there are some other running backs coming to your mind right now, the likes of David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara, Isaiah Pacheco, but all those guys were drafted in the 70s. Let me remind you, Raheem Mostert has not only been better than them, but drafted 40 spots later on average. So shout out to Raheem Must Start. I traded you after a few weeks, but thank you for your service. All right, this next award is in honor of Geno Smith because this is the "they wrote me off, I ain't right back though" award. And it goes to the aforementioned Adam Thielen. Look, Raheem Mostert was at least a guy that people somewhat had on their fantasy radar. I mean, we figured he would be in a split with Jeff Wilson whenever Wilson got healthy, or that he would be splitting to start the season with somebody else. Obviously, we didn't picture this incredibly elite outcome, but people were at least thinking about him. People were not thinking about Adam Thielen. People had written off Adam Thielen completely because of old age, going to the Carolina Panthers. It was basically like putting him out to pasture. Like, these are just the waning years of his career. We're not expecting anything from the guy. And Adam Thielen says, okay, how's wide receiver 8 in PPR through the first half of the season sound? I mean, damn, King, go off, I guess. Thielen has been a waiver revelation if you were able to get him after the first couple weeks. And honestly, even after the first couple weeks, people weren't really picking him up because we were like, is this real? It's real. And as long as he stays healthy, I expect him to continue to be Bryce Young's primary weapon. So good for Adam Thielen coming back and saying, hey, I got at least one more in me. Don't write me off just yet. One runner-up for this award is Keenan Allen. Obviously was much more on people's radar than Adam Thielen was, but people were still very concerned about his age. People certainly didn't expect him to be the wide receiver 6 of the first half of the season, given his 4th round ADP. And one more runner-up. I hate to do this, but I gotta do it. Broncos country, let's ride. It's Russell Wilson. If you can't tell, this category is basically just old dudes who we didn't think would ever do anything again. And look, Russell Wilson hasn't been some revelation, but he is QB 11 with 16.83 points per game. That's a startable back-end QB1, or at least a high-level streamer. He may not light up the stat sheet in terms of yards, but he is 4th in the NFL in passing touchdowns with 16. I guess Sean Payton turned the offense around. Now the defense, on the other hand. All right, fantasy breakout player of the first half goes to Zach Moss. I mean, who saw this coming? Obviously, we were all enamored by the Jonathan Taylor drama in the preseason and the start of the regular season. We thought it would be rookie Evan Hull leading the way, and then he went on IR, and then the Colts bring in Zach Moss, and no one thinks much of it. And Zach Moss says, all right, I'll make you think something of it, because he is currently the PPR RB4 and 2nd in the NFL in rushing yards behind only Christian McCaffrey. Not only that, but Jonathan Taylor's back, and Zach Moss isn't going away. In fact, he's put up at least 14 points in 3 of the 4 games that Jonathan Taylor has played, including his best game of the season in Taylor's first game back, where he went for 165 yards and 2 touchdowns. Raise your hand if you thought Zach Moss would be relevant this season. Okay, keep your hand raised if you thought Zach Moss would be relevant this season after Jonathan Taylor came back. Okay, put your hands down, you dirty liars. I have no idea what the second half of the season has in store for Zach Moss, considering you assume Jonathan Taylor will only get more involved. But at this point, Zach Moss is doing everything he can to stick around. Some other players I considered here, Jacoby Myers, maybe one of the most underrated players in fantasy football so far. Nobody's really talked about him, and all he's done is put up a cool 15.5 PPR points per game en route to being wide receiver 20 so far. In fact, on the season, he's only 10 points behind his teammate, Devontae Adams. And the other player I considered here, and he could have easily won this award had he not gotten injured, Kyren Williams. Just a dominant RB1 for the Rams. Honestly, he's been everything we wanted Cam Akers to be. Sadly, injuries more or less disqualified him from this award, which I'm sure he's devastated about, but hopefully he'll be back for most of the second half of the season. All right, this next award is one of my personal favorites, the Where the F Did You Come From award. This award is presented to the player who I had essentially never heard of until maybe a couple weeks before the season, and you guessed it, it's Puka Nacua. Look, I had heard some rumblings here and there that Puka was impressing at Rams camp, but nothing that would indicate he would do anything like this. At the midway point in the season, Puka Nacua is currently the PPR wide receiver 4. After like the first month of the season, when you look at the top wide receivers in fantasy football, he stuck out like a sore thumb. It looked like somebody put a random player in there that didn't belong. You got Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, Stephon Diggs, Puka Nacua. But good for Puka, man. I mean, a 5th round receiver breaking out like this, it's been incredibly fun to watch, incredibly impressive, but also incredibly, where the f did you come from? Other players I considered here, Puka's teammate, Tutu Atwell, who was also very productive to start the season. Then you've got Josh Dobbs. He came out of absolutely nowhere and made the Cardinals way more competitive than we expected. All of that leading up to him being QB 12 in fantasy so far. And then Rashid Shaheed, a guy who flashed a little bit last year with some big plays, but nobody expected anything from consistently. And I still don't know if I'd call him consistent, but he's making a lot of those big plays again this year. So shout out to all these guys. I don't really know where the f you came from, but I'm glad you came. Ayo. All right, Fantasy Rookie of the Year. Puka Nacua. Yeah, Puka's kind of sweeping these last few awards, which I'm not upset about. I mean, Puka honestly epitomizes what we love about fantasy football. Guys who come out of just absolutely nowhere, like I just talked about, and become huge difference makers for both their team and your fantasy teams. Now, being Fantasy Rookie of the Year, or Fantasy Rookie of the Half Year, is no small feat given the competition he has. I mean, you've got Devon Achane, who probably would have won this award if he didn't get hurt. Sam Laporta, who again is tight end 3 on the year and has put himself among the likes of Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and TJ Hawkinson. Jordan Addison, who's second in the NFL in receiving touchdowns behind only Tyreek Hill. And that's without even mentioning guys like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs, who have been pretty solid, but just not unleashed in the way we hoped they would be. And of course, Anthony Richardson, who easily could have won this award if he didn't go on IR. All of this to say, Puka's been the king of the rookies so far. I mean, wide receiver 4 is no joke. And finally, waiver pickup of the year. Puka Nacua. Shocking, I know. Another award with some familiar names as the runner-ups. Runners-up. I don't like that. Another award with some familiar names as the other contenders. Once again, Devon Achane, who could have been the winner if he didn't get hurt. And then Zach Moss, who didn't get hurt, but is just a tick below Puka in terms of fantasy points so far. I think the term league winner gets thrown around way too much when it comes to waiver pickups, but Puka Nacua, absolutely a league winner. Now, would I be surprised to see this award go to someone else when I do my final end of season awards? Absolutely not, because Devon Achane and Kyron Williams have plenty of time to come off IR and make an impact, and there's plenty of time for somebody else to emerge as well. There you have it, my 2023 Midseason Fantasy Football Awards. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my picks. Of course, leave all your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.